You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 4th of May. Low turnout in polls affects final outcome. Glasgow illegal accused of helping suicide bomber in Sweden. So-called British rich list misnomer. Eve of polls broadcast from Nick Griffin MEP We Are Not Going Away. Nationalism on the rise in Greece. Thought for the day, a Londoner's lament. UK news. Only 30% of the voters in Liverpool turned out to vote for the mayoral election. The turnout was very, very poor, one nationalist reporter commented. Less than a third of the voters, with Anderson getting 57% of that. Thousands of voters did not vote for Labour in a city that has been bogged down by the traditional Labour vote of my dad and his dad voted Labour scenario. On a tight budget, Anderson has promised 12 new schools, thousands of jobs and 5,000 new houses. A comment was overheard that the bigger the socialists lie, the more people will believe it. Nasruddin Menai, living illegally in Glasgow, is in court over helping another Muslim in a suicide bomb attack in Sweden. The attack that took place in Stockholm in 2010 was targeting a busy shopping centre with women and children present. Many is the suspects involved with Taimur Abdul Wahab, the suicide bomber. Many used a fake identity to seek asylum in Britain. The trial will last 12 weeks and cost the price of housing a British homeless family. Britain's rich enjoying record wealth. A rather forced statement since all of those with the most wealth are not British or even born here. Steel tycoon Lakshmi Mittal is still the richest of them all according to this year's Sunday Times Rich List. And so reports Sky News. Lakshmi Mittal, Alisher Usmanov and Roman Abramovich occupy the top 3 places on the list. The Hinduja brothers claim the 4th spot and the richest Brit is the Duke of Westminster in 7th place. I will not go into the many billions of pounds these men have between them, otherwise we will have all the World at 8 listeners going a whiter shade of pale with envy, me included. Ferret Beresford, the Rich List compiler, cautioned the Sky News reporter against bashing the rich because a lot of the people on this rich list are based here, they're investing in companies here, and if they get richer, hopefully the rest of us will get a bit more prosperous on the rising tide of wealth. 243rd on the list is a non-inherited wealth Briton, Michael Oliver, who runs the biggest valve-making company in Europe. Beresford also crows, a lot of Russians find London to be less corrupt, less dangerous than Moscow or St. Petersburg, for instance. Well, Mr. Beresford, the trouble here is that when in Rome, do as the Romans do, and they don't. Soon we will have a little Russia in London, as well as a little China, a little Africa, a little Saudi, a little India, and a little Pakistan, to name a few. Let us hope these parasites feed off their own kind and not ours. Nick Griffin comes to us at the end of Thursday, a busy campaigning day in London, declaring, "We are not going away. I give you Nick Griffin MEP."
I'm recording this not from Brussels, but at the end of a busy eve of poll day campaigning in London. By the time you hear this, a lot of the results will be in, with just the London verdict to come. So I won't speculate on how things will go. All I'll say is that after several days crisscrossing London, handing out leaflets on shopping precincts and doing my bit in one of our speaker vans, I can tell you that the focus on postal vote fraud among the Muslim community that's in some of the papers is frankly missing the point. The real fraud, the real denial of democracy is far, far worse. I saw much of London in the last GLA contest in 2008. And from what I've seen of the last few days, I have to tell you that the demographic shift since then has been absolutely massive. In just 4 years, huge swathes of outer London, which even then was still essentially English, have been colonised by the Third World. Dame Shirley Porter was famously and deservedly prosecuted for organising the gerrymandering of a couple of marginal wards in central London by paying a few dozen working-class council tenants, who'd normally vote Labour, to move out, in order to replace them with yuppies who could be relied upon to vote Tory. She was duly found guilty and sentenced to prison. But if changing the population to the tune of a couple of dozen warrants a prison sentence, then what would be a just penalty for the Labour and Condemned politicians who are importing hundreds of thousands of new voters every year in order to dilute and outweigh the votes of the indigenous population who they know perfectly well can no longer be relied upon to vote as they're supposed to? With more than 100,000 Londoners moving out of the capital every year, and substantially more immigrants than that moving in, the shocking reality is that in the last 4 years alone, the electoral balance has been tipped against the British National Party in London to the tune of around 1 million votes simply by migration. Add in the impact of the number of elderly real Londoners dying and their imported replacements reaching voting age, and you get an idea of the scale of the demographic disaster that has been imposed upon our capital city as a cold-blooded act of cultural destruction and deliberate ethnocide. It is the murder of Englishness in the ancient capital of England. I, like millions of other exiled Londoners, am now a stranger in the town of my birth. Londoners who've clung on are foreigners in their own streets and are being disenfranchised by the biggest gerrymandering operation in British history. It's a giant social engineering scheme that will inevitably end up going horribly wrong, making the 3 or 4 way civil war that tore apart the former Yugoslavia look like a playground scuffle. It makes me want to weep. But it also makes me very angry, and it makes me more determined than ever to work to ensure that other great cities and beautiful towns in our British Isles, many of them still relatively untouched by this multicult madness, do not go the same way. There is still time to turn it all around. There have been headlines recently of moves by some inner London boroughs to start shifting some of their surplus population out to places like Stoke and Newcastle. Well, the difference between when they started to flood London and these new schemes is that we weren't ready for them back then, whereas now we are. In those days, virtually no one knew anything about anyone organising to give voice to their worries about the flood. But I've campaigned in the northeast of England and in Stoke, and I can tell you that everybody there knows where we stand, and that most of them have massive respect for us as a result. Up until now, however, they haven't really needed us. With London now full to overflowing, that's going to change very rapidly. Whatever the result of these elections, we finance them from current income. The several big legacies coming our way are still in the pipeline. And what have we achieved? We've gained several £million worth of publicity for our new heart logo, for the fact that we have articulate and well-informed mayoral candidates, and the fact that, despite all the media crowing last year, we're still here and we're back on fighting form. Whatever happens, we're not going away. So we move on to a summer of activity for us, and a summer of nightmarish headlines about financial collapses, political bickering, and more PC madness for the old parties. You must know as well as I do that everyone out there is sick of it all. Many, unfortunately, are so sick of it that at present they've given up, believing that if they stick their heads in the sand for a couple of years, perhaps everything may sort itself out. Well, as you know, it won't. Our masters will keep on with their schemes to deindustrialise our economy, give away the last of our freedoms to Brussels, and to replace us in our own country until we, the people, rise up and replace them. Not just swapping from Tweedlecon to Tweedlelab and back again, but getting rid of the whole rotten lot of them for good. That's why we'll be out there again this summer, because there are now millions of good people out there who no longer need persuading that we're right. They just need hope that we can win. They just need to know that they're not alone in understanding that things can't go on as they are. They need hope that this wonderful country of ours can be saved. Hope that we can secure a future for our children in the land that our grandparents built for us. I know you share these hopes, so I thank everyone who stood in these elections, who worked in these elections, and all the people who voted for us in these elections. So now take a few days off, then let's get back to work, because there's lots we've got to do, because our time will come, so we must be ready for it.
World news. Nationalists are on the rise across Greece. Huge slogans are being painted across buildings by Greek citizens who have had enough of the Eurozone and its financial penalties to those who are involved in it. The Greeks are also angry about the cheap immigrant labour used to keep its people down. The slogans, which read "immigrants out," are referring to the Greek jobs going to Eastern European immigrants. That and the debt crisis have contributed to the downfall of one of the world's most beautiful and proud countries. Yet another for the European socialist melting pot. Nicolas Sarkozy got the answer he dreaded in a French radio programme which asked the question, Did France have too many immigrants? To which a resounding yes was the reply. Another question was put forward, which was the failure of these people to integrate. The overall consensus on this is that immigrants do not want to integrate in France. They want to impose their way of life and culture on the indigenous people. It comes under the infamous human rights laws. Although in that country at least most of these immigrants can speak French, unlike immigrants into the UK. One hopes that France will not go to the socialist vote, because that will give power to students and unions, all of which want multiculturalism to succeed. Thought for the day, a Londoner's lament. Oh, my poor London. I was born in the centre of London, Welbeck Street to be exact. My parents lived at Maitland Court near Marble Arch. I was christened at St Mary's in Paddington. Although my mother left London when my father died when I was a baby, I still love that particular part of London. Both my parents had their ashes scattered in Hyde Park, and I have contributed some years ago to having a plaque in their memory on the Isis statue. I did live and work in London in the 60s and then again in the early 70s, and even then the change was creeping in. Suffice to say, I agree totally with the words of Nick Griffin, another London-born nationalist. London is lost as we knew it. You can compare photos of Oxford Street even in the early 80s with those now, and you can see the ethnics have increased 100-fold. When I lived in London you used to see very smart city types and well-dressed women walking along Regent Street, which was always considered much more fashionable than Oxford Street. Lovely shops, lovely people. And now a jumble of drab Dagenham dustbins with tribe in tow, jeans the dress of choice for male and female, men who look like they've just swept the street let alone hold down a job, drab, shabby and shabbier. The smart rich people have gone and left what? There is an email going around that Europe kills 6 million Jews and to replace them with 30 million Muslims, and I think most of them are here. All London markets are ethnic controlled. The taxis are holding out, but not for long, under the tremendous amount of immigration, both legal and illegal, being encouraged by various governments. The fuss at Heathrow about the times these people have to wait to get into the country, tough. I would have toll booths erected at Heathrow and make them pay huge amounts of money to come in at all, plus of course a Kalishnikov. You and I know that those who come in for universities are usually not students. Those who come in for tourists usually stay, and those who come in for contract work disappear as soon as their foot touches English soil. What can you do to defeat voter apathy? And finally, the superb Red Arrows will be flying again at the Clacton Air Show, after the tragic death of one of its pilots, Flight Lieutenant John Eggin, who sadly died in a crash in Bournemouth. The greatest pilots in the world will be putting on their show once again and entertaining the eagerly watching crowds below under British skies. You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozart. From all of us at Radio Britain, I wish all nationalists a very safe and a happy weekend. British Rich List misnomer. Eve of polls broadcast from Nick Griffin MEP We Are Not Going Away. Nationalism on the rise in Greece. Thought for the day, a Londoner's lament. UK news. Only 30% of the voters in Liverpool turned out voted Labour scenario. On a tight budget, Anderson has promised 12 new schools, thousands of jobs and 5,000 new houses. A comment was overheard that the bigger the socialists lie, the more people will believe it. Nasruddin Menai, living illegally in Glasgow, is to vote for the mayoral election. The turnout was very, very poor, one nationalist reporter commented. Less than a third of the voters, with Anderson getting 57% of that. Thousands of voters did not vote for Labour in a city that has been bogged down by the traditional Labour vote of my dad and his dad vote.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. Nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 4th of May. Low turnout in polls affects final outcome. Glasgow illegal accused of helping suicide bomber in Sweden. So-called